He didn't lose a war. He lost her on purpose. And the empire he thought he was saving, it started dying the moment she walked out that gate. If you've ever watched someone choose power over the person who made them powerful, stay until the end. This story will crack something open in you. Drop your city in the comments. Hit that like. You already know why you're here. The morning Kyle Dravenheart publicly rejected the woman who had spent 6 years building his empire, the sky over Veilor was cloudless and brutal with summer heat. No convenient storm, no ravens scattering in omen-heavy flight, just white sun hammering the obsidian plaza, and 10,000 souls packed shoulder to shoulder behind iron barricades, sweat-damp and silent in the way crowds go silent when they sense something irreversible is about to happen. Lunara Vale stood at the top of the palace steps in the same gray campaign coat she'd worn to 17 separate negotiations over the past 3 years. The coat had a repaired tear along the left shoulder where a mercenary commander in the Hearthen borderlands had grabbed her during a parley gone wrong. She'd sewn it herself, rough stitches, functional and unashamed. She had not dressed for a ceremony. She had dressed for a working day because nobody had told her this morning was anything other than that. She was 31 years old. She had the kind of face that didn't photograph well for palace portraits because it moved too much, too expressive, too quick, always calculating or reacting or suppressing something. Her hair was pulled back the way she pulled it back when she was managing logistics, fast, practical, slightly imperfect. There was ink on her right hand from the irrigation proposals she'd been reviewing at dawn. She was still holding the proposals. The rolled parchment in her left hand made her look like she'd been interrupted mid-sentence, which she had. A steward had appeared at her study door 40 minutes ago and said the Alpha King required her presence in the plaza for a public address. She'd assumed policy. She'd assumed ceremony. She'd assumed she was being called to stand beside him the way she always stood beside him, slightly behind and to the left, the position that said second in command without saying it in words, because Kyle had always been precise about how power was displayed. She had not assumed this. Kale stood at the stone podium 10 feet away from her, and he had not looked at her once. He was in formal war black, the chest piece engraved with the Dravenheart wolf crest, the cape that only came out for declarations and treaty signings. His jaw was set in the particular way it's set when he was doing something that required total internal shutdown. She knew that jaw. She had mapped every expression on that face across 6 years of working beside him, sleeping beside him, arguing with him until 2 in the morning over grain allocation and troop positioning and the political consequences of mercy. She knew when he was performing strength and when he was actually frightened. He was frightened right now, which was worse than cruelty would have been. The council members stood in a formal line behind him. High Chancellor Merrick Vane, 63 years old and immaculate, with the satisfied stillness of a man who has arranged exactly the outcome he wanted. Lord Castor Aldenmere, commander of the northern garrison, studying the crowd. 4 other men whose influence Lunara had spent years trying to limit because she understood what they wanted and what they were willing to do to get it. She understood what this was. She understood it with the cold hydraulic clarity that sometimes overtook her in moments of extreme stress. Not panic, but a kind of terrible lucidity, every element snapping into alignment so fast it felt like something breaking. People of Veilor. Kale's voice carried without amplification. It always had. He had the kind of voice that cut through crowd noise and wind and the animal anxiety of large gatherings, deep and controlled and certain. I speak today regarding the matter of the Empire's future and the political alliance that will secure our southern borders. She kept her face still. She had learned that early, before Kyle, before the palace, back when stillness was the only shield a woman without a title or a garrison had in rooms full of men who were looking for weakness to use. The Southern Coalition, led by Emperor Siroth Valdur, has agreed to a permanent peace treaty and the withdrawal of forces from the Ember Straits. In exchange, this alliance requires a formal bond of blood and covenant. He paused. One breath. I have agreed to this bond. I will take Lady Saris Valdur as my bound mate and empress. The crowd didn't make noise. They made that worst thing. A collective held breath, 10,000 people processing. The arrangement with the Luna Lunara Vale is formally dissolved. She had been prepared for it, and she still felt it land like a boot to the sternum, driving the air out. The parchment in her hand crinkled slightly. She noticed she was gripping it harder than necessary and made herself relax her fingers. Kyle still had not looked at her. Luna Vale's service to the Empire has been, don't. Her voice came out quiet, conversational, which was worse, she knew, than shouting. Shouting could be dismissed. Don't finish that sentence. The plaza went absolutely still. Kale's jaw tightened. The muscle along his left cheek jumped once. He turned to look at her for the first time, and she saw it. The thing he was burying with both hands. The thing that had cost him something to bury. And it did not help her. Seeing his pain did not help her at all. This is not the appropriate... You called me here, she said. You had a steward pull me out of a budget meeting with irrigation parchment still in my hand so I could stand 10 feet from you while you announced this to 10,000 people. She let a half-second pass. This is exactly the appropriate form. You made it so. Merrick Vane moved forward slightly. Luna Vale, this is a matter of Imperial. Chancellor Vane. She didn't look at him. I will get to you. She looked at Kyle, just at Kyle. 6 years. The memory of it moved through her not as emotion but as inventory because that was how her mind worked under pressure. 6 years of campaign tents and border negotiations and 18-hour days building administrative systems for territories that had been rubble when they arrived. She had sat in on every major treaty. She had drafted the language that turned Harthan Province from a war-occupied territory into a contributing member of the Empire because she'd understood that occupation produces resentment, and resentment produces the next war. She had been right. Kyle had implemented her framework over the Council's objection. Harthan Province now supplied 15% of the Empire's grain. She had done that. She had done all of it, and she had done it not because she was asked to, but because she was good at it, because there was something in her that needed to build things that lasted, needed to look at a broken system and find the structural failure and correct it. She had thought she was doing it beside a man who understood what she was doing, a man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway, not despite her capability, but because of it. Look at me, she said, quietly. Not a plea, a command. He was already looking at her. He had been looking at her since she spoke, and his face was doing that lockdown thing, the emotional shutdown that she had always, until this morning, been able to break through. I need you to say it to me directly, she said. Not to the crowd, to me. If you can do this, you can do that much. Something moved behind his eyes. Grief, maybe. Or guilt. Or the particular self-disgust of a man who knows he is choosing correctly and cannot stand himself for it. The alliance requires... I know what the alliance requires. Her voice didn't rise. I was in the room when Vane proposed it. I was in the room 3 weeks ago when you told him you needed time to consider. I am aware of the structural argument, and I am aware that Sirath Valdur has 50,000 soldiers positioned at the Ember Straits, and that without this treaty, they march north before winter. She exhaled once through her nose. I understand the logic, Kael. I want you to say it to me, not explain it. Say it. The plaza was a held breath, 10,000 people not moving. It's over, he said, and his voice, for just that syllable, cracked along the edge in a way that she was certain only she could hear because she was the only person who knew what his voice sounded like when it was about to break. What we had. I am ending it. I am choosing the Empire. She nodded, once, slowly. All right, she said. She looked down at the irrigation proposals in her hand. The morning she'd woken up and started reviewing them felt like a different century. She thought about the notation she'd made in the margin about the eastern tributary, a bottleneck she'd identified that was costing 2 farming districts their spring planting window. She thought about how she'd been about to bring it to Kael's attention so they could push through the fix before the late summer dry season. She set the proposals on the stone railing beside her, carefully, precisely. She looked at Merrick Vane. He had the expression of a man successfully concluding a long project, and she filed that away. Not for revenge, not yet, maybe not ever, but as data. He had wanted her gone badly enough to manufacture this. She would need to understand eventually what he planned to do with her absence. You got what you wanted, she said to him. I hope it produces what you think it will. She looked at Kael one more time. He was still watching her with that locked, aching expression. She didn't give him tears. She didn't give him a speech. She didn't give him the collapse he might have braced for, the scene that would let him reassemble himself around the narrative that she hadn't understood, that she was too emotional for the reality of empire, that this had been kindness. She picked up nothing. She walked down the steps. The crowd parted. People moved before her not because they were afraid, or not only because of that, but in the involuntary way that crowds move before someone who has completely stopped caring about what the crowd is doing. She walked through them, and she did not look back, and she did not slow down, and she was still walking when she passed through the outer palace gate, and the iron doors closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She walked for 2 hours before she stopped. The city peeled away behind her. The Grand Central Quarter, then the merchant rings, then the outer residential warrens where the palace staff and minor tradespeople lived, and then the edge districts where the buildings got lower and the roads got rougher, and nobody was surprised to see a person walking alone with nothing. She ended up at the river. The Veil, the one the city was half named after. She had negotiated water rights for 4 different provinces along this river's length. She knew its flow rates by season, its documented flood patterns, the agricultural potential of its southern delta. She had written a 40-page proposal on the Veil's management last spring, and Kael had approved the first phase. She sat on a broken dock with her boots off and her feet in the cold current and let herself have 10 minutes. She had learned this years ago, the value of a precisely bounded grief. Not suppression, not the pretending, just a container. You pour it in, you set a limit, you let yourself feel it fully inside that limit, and then you pick it up and carry it differently. She felt it fully. She let herself admit inside that 10-minute container that she was gutted, that the thing with Kael had not been a working arrangement to her, had not been primarily political, had been the most real thing in her adult life. That the look on his face when he said it, the crack at the edge of his voice, would live in her for years. That she had believed, until 40 minutes ago, that she was finally somewhere she was supposed to be. She let herself feel it, and then she let the 10 minutes end. She put her boots back on. You have nothing, said the man at the east wall gate. He was garrison grade, young, doing the math on whether she was worth detaining. No horse, no seal, no marks on you. What makes you think you walk through this gate? I don't need marks, she said. I know how gates work. Open it or don't. He opened it. She had always understood that authority was, at its core, a story people told themselves about other people. The woman who walked like she knew where she was going and expected the road to accommodate her was more compelling than any seal or official documentation. She had never been naive enough to think that trick worked forever, but it worked well enough for a gate. Beyond the east wall, the empire thinned and then ended. The ruined territories began. The borderlands that had been contested and partially destroyed in the wars before Kael consolidated power. The places that had never quite been rehabilitated because there was always something more urgent, always some other province requiring attention, always a reason to defer the reconstruction of places where nobody with political influence happened to live. She had put those territories on lists. She had written proposals about them. She had prioritized them for the next phase. She walked into them with nothing but what she was carrying inside her head. And inside her head, she had 6 years of administrative architecture, political mapping, resource management theory, and an intimate understanding of what made a broken territory into a functional one. She had nothing. She had exactly enough. Us. The first person she met past the east wall was a woman named Hess, maybe 50, with a burned left arm, healed badly, and a cart of salvage metal being pulled by a donkey that looked older than the burned arm. You're walking the wrong direction, Hess said. If you're headed back to the city, I'm not. Then you're headed into the waste. I'm aware of what I'm headed into. Hess studied her. The look of a person who has spent years reading strangers for threat assessment. You eat today? No? Get on the cart. She got on the cart. Boked. 3 weeks later, Lunara had a map. She had drawn it herself on the back of salvaged parchment using charcoal from a cooking fire, and it covered approximately 400 miles of nominally abandoned territory between the empire's eastern edge and what had once been the Grayfin principalities before the war collapsed them. The map showed 6 settlements that were not on any official Valor census. It showed 3 river tributaries that were not being used. It showed a salt flat that could support evaporation production, a granite shelf that had never been quarried, 3 former trade roads that were intact underneath 20 years of neglect. She had gotten most of this by walking and asking. The people in the waste, the ones who had stayed when the official world left, they knew the land. They had mapped it in their heads out of necessity. She had learned a long time ago that the people who maintained invisible knowledge were always the ones who had been told their knowledge didn't matter. She sat in the ruins of what had once been a way station inn and looked at her map by firelight, and she thought about the gap between what these territories were and what they could structurally become. And she felt the thing she always felt when she looked at a broken system with a clear failure point, the clean, cold pull of a problem she could actually solve. Hess was watching her from across the fire. "You're planning something," Hess said. "I'm always planning something." "What are you planning?" Lunara looked up from the map. She looked at Hess, the burned arm, the salvage cart, the face of someone who had been surviving on the margins of someone else's civilization for a long time and was tired of it but had run out of options that weren't survival. "Do you know anyone who builds things?" Lunara said. "What kind of things?" "Any kind. Engineering, construction, fortification, people who know how materials work." Hess was quiet for a moment. "There's a man in Duskfen. Harlan. He built the bridge at Duskfen Crossing by himself after the war dropped it. Nobody paid him. He just did it because he needed to get across the river." "I need to meet Harlan." "Why?" Lunara looked back down at her map. She traced the eastern tributary with one finger. She thought about the salt flat, the granite shelf, the 6 uncounted settlements, the 3 intact roadbeds underneath the decades of abandonment. "Because I need someone who builds things nobody's paying him to build," she said, "and I need him to start thinking bigger." She met Harlan in Duskfen 6 days later. He was 44, square-built, with the kind of hands that are mapped with old cuts. He met her in the doorway of a half-repaired granary that he was apparently rebuilding in his spare hours after the primary work of surviving. "You built the Duskfen Bridge," she said. "Needed crossing." He looked at her without particular interest. "Who are you?" "My name is Lunara Vale. I was the Luna of the Valor Empire until approximately a month ago." He studied her. "You're the one who got cut loose." "Yes." "What do you want from me?" She pulled out her map and unrolled it on the granary wall, pressing it flat with both palms. "I want to know if what I'm seeing is structurally viable," she said. "The eastern tributary junction here. If it were redirected using the natural gradient of the shelf to the north, what could it feed?" Harlan stepped closer to the map. His expression shifted. The particular shift of a man who cannot help caring about a structural problem even when he's trying to not care. "Where'd you get this survey?" "I walked it." "You walked 400 miles of waste country?" "I walked it twice in different directions. The second pass was to check the tributary gradient." She moved her finger along the map. "Tell me I'm wrong about the shelf." He was quiet for almost a full minute. She waited. She had learned that the people who didn't rush to fill silence were usually the people worth waiting for. "You're not wrong about the shelf," he said finally. "I thought about the same redirect years ago. Before—" He stopped, started again. "Before I stopped thinking about things that required resources I didn't have." "What would you need to make it viable?" "Labor? Materiel? 12 to 14 people who know what they're doing. 3 months." He looked at her. "You don't have any of that." "Not yet. Not ever." He said it without cruelty. Just the tired mathematics of a man who has wanted things before. "You're one person in the waste with a charcoal map. 2 months ago, I was one person with a charcoal map and no map." She held his gaze. "In 2 months, I've talked to 6 settlements and identified 47 people with specific technical knowledge who are currently doing nothing because nobody has organized them into a system." "Harlan, I'm not asking you to believe in anything yet. I'm asking you to tell me if the structural analysis is correct." He looked at the map for a long time. "The analysis is correct," he said. "Then come with me to Duskfen Settlement in the morning. I need you to meet someone who knows the salt flat and a woman who ran a quarry operation for 8 years before the war stopped it. And I need all of you in the same room so we can figure out what's actually possible before I start making promises." He said nothing. "I'm not offering you money," she said. "I'm not offering you safety. I'm not offering you anything I don't have. I'm offering you the first real problem I've ever seen that I think is actually solvable if the right people take it seriously." She looked at him directly. "Is that enough?" The granary around them was half finished. The walls he'd been repairing for months in his spare time, stone by stone, for no audience and no payment, because something in him couldn't leave a broken thing unfinished. "Morning," he said. "I'll be at the gate." They were 7 by the end of the week. 7, then 12, then 23. She did not recruit the way recruiters recruited. She did not promise or persuade or paint visions. She found people who were already doing things, who had been doing things in isolation without audience or infrastructure or acknowledgement, and she showed them what they could do if they were doing it together. She made the map larger. She mapped the political connectivity alongside the physical geography, the alliances between settlements, the historical grievances and the practical supply chains, the places where resources existed without anyone to root them. She had Harlan, who could build anything, and had spent 3 years rebuilding things that required no justification to anyone. She had a woman named Drea, who had managed clan supply chains through 2 wars and could calculate resource distribution in her head. She had a former Veilor engineer named Solt, who had been exiled from the Empire's infrastructure core 8 years ago over a political dispute, and who had been rebuilding bridges in the waste for no salary ever since. She had an ex-mercenary captain named Vark, who ran a settlement of 200 displaced people with the organizational precision of a military campaign because that was the only way he knew how to keep them alive. And she had Hess, with her salvage cart and her burned arm, and her 50 years of watching the waste from the inside, who knew things about these territories that no official survey had ever captured because no official survey had ever cared. "You're building something," Vark said to her one evening. They were reviewing food inventory in what had become, almost without formal decision, a planning room, an abandoned customs hall that someone had started cleaning up and someone else had started repairing, and which now, 3 weeks in, had maps on every wall and a constant low noise of people working. "Obviously," she said. "I mean something serious, not a settlement, not a camp." He looked at the maps. "You're thinking government." She was quiet for a moment. She had not said the word yet because the word carried a weight that she wasn't sure the structure could yet support. And she had learned, one of the harder lessons, that naming a thing too early could collapse it. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "about what a functional civilization actually requires at its foundation. Not its surface, its foundation. And I'm thinking that the territories between the Empire's eastern edge and the old Grayfin principalities have those foundational requirements available: water, materials, population, knowledge, and have never had anyone organize them because Veilor never valued them enough to try." Vark looked at her. "And you're going to try." "I already am." He was quiet for a moment. The maps around them showed 400 miles of abandoned territory in handwritten charcoal detail. "What do you call it?" he said. She had been thinking about this for days. Not the name, that was almost secondary, but what the name needed to carry. Not a territory. Not a settlement, something that held the specific weight of what it was, something built from the leftover parts of collapsed things, something forged in the gap between empires, something that had the grit of survival baked into its architecture. "The Ashen Dominion," she said. Vark repeated it once, quietly, letting it sit. "All right," he said. "What do we build first?" 600 miles to the west, in the palace at Veilor, Kyle Dravenheart was not sleeping. He sat in the study where he had met with Lunara 1,000 times. Her chair was still at the angle she'd left it, slightly turned toward the window, which was how she sat when she was thinking rather than when she was working. And he looked at the irrigation proposals she'd set on the railing. A steward had brought them inside. Careful, respectful, as if they were important documents. They were important documents. He had read them. In the margin, in her handwriting, fast, angular, ink-heavy, was a notation about the eastern tributary bottleneck, Fix before dry season, bottleneck costing 2 districts. Her handwriting went slightly irregular at the end of the note, which meant she'd written it quickly, probably while thinking about something else simultaneously. He had read the notation 5 times. He picked up his glass and found it empty and did not refill it, and sat in the silence of the study that had her chair in it at the wrong angle and thought about what she'd said to him on the plaza steps. Not the formal part, the last part, just before she walked away. You got what you wanted. I hope it produces what you think it will. Not directed at him, at Vane. She had said it to Vane as a statement of documented fact, the way she cataloged everything, without drama, without excess, with that particular precision that had once felt like the clearest thing in his life. From the corridor outside the study came the sound of a door. Merrick Vane's voice, even at this hour, in conversation with someone Kael didn't immediately identify. The new political calculus moving its pieces around the board. The council already repositioning now that the obstacle, that was what she had been to them, an obstacle. A commoner with no bloodline who had somehow accumulated more genuine loyalty from the Empire's population than half the High families combined, was removed. He had known what she was to the council. He had understood, going in, that the marriage to Cerys Valdur was as much about removing Lunara as it was about the Southern Alliance. Vane had laid it out with unusual directness. The Alliance requires it, and the Council requires it, and if you do not do this, the Alliance unravels, and the Council makes the next 4 years untenable. He had the votes, he had the leverage, he had the Southern Emperor's appetite for war positioned like a blade. Kael had done the math. He had made the calculation that a king was supposed to make: empire over individual, structure over feeling, the long term over the immediate cost. He had been right. The math was correct. He was still right. He looked at her chair. He thought about the sound her voice had made when she said, "All right." Not broken, not resigned, not the voice of someone being destroyed, the voice of someone completing an inventory, something assessed, accounted for, filed. He should go to bed. He had a council briefing in 4 hours and a preliminary meeting with the Valdur delegation's advance envoy in the afternoon, and then a reception he could not avoid. He did not go to bed. He sat in the chair across from her empty one and looked at the irrigation proposals and thought about the eastern tributary bottleneck she'd identified and the 2 farming districts losing their spring planting window. And he thought about the fact that she had walked out of his palace 12 days ago with nothing, no title, no resources, no formal support, and that she was somewhere in the world right now, with that mind running at full speed, aimed at something. He did not know what she was building. He was starting to suspect he would find out. In the eastern waste, past the Empire's edge, in a former customs hall with maps on every wall, Lunara Vale was still awake at midnight, working on a problem she'd identified in the water routing that would need to be solved before construction could begin. She had been working on it for 3 hours. She was not thinking about Kael. She was thinking about the problem. She was thinking about the problem because the problem was solvable, and Kael was not, and she had learned the hardest lesson, the one that cost the most, that the only way through a loss that size was to put your entire self into something real, something structural, something that required everything you had and then asked for more. And to let the work be the thing that held you together while the grief did what grief did in the dark hours when the work stopped. The work didn't stop. She kept it from stopping. She had the tributary routing half solved when Harlan's voice came from the doorway. "You need to look at something." She didn't look up. "Can it wait until morning?" "No." His voice had a texture in it she hadn't heard before, something between urgency and controlled alarm. "There are riders on the eastern road, 20, maybe more, coming fast." She set down her charcoal. She looked up. "Colors," she said. "That's the thing." He paused. "They're flying the Valdur standard. The Southern Emperor's colors. Here. On a road that didn't officially exist in any Valor record, in territories that the Empire had declared empty, riding toward the one consolidated outpost of organized people in 400 miles of waste. The Southern Emperor. The man Kael had just made peace with. The man whose daughter Kael had just agreed to take as Empress. The man who had apparently decided that the woman Kael had just discarded was worth sending 20 riders to find at midnight. Lunara stood up from the table. She moved to the door and looked out into the dark and saw the torches on the road. 23, she counted, riding in tight formation, moving with military discipline. "Wake everyone," she said quietly. "Everything we've built here, everything on those maps. Make sure nothing can be read if we need to move fast." "Are we running?" She watched the torches for a moment. She thought about what the Southern Emperor knew about these territories that made him send riders here specifically. She thought about what he wanted with a discarded Luna who had walked out of a palace 12 days ago with nothing. She thought about what she was building. "Not yet," she said. "Find out what they want first." The torches were closer now. The horses were slowing, and in the dark between her and those riders was the question that would break the next phase of everything open. Whether the Southern Emperor had come here to offer something, or to take something, or to destroy something he'd already decided she was building before she had a name for it. The lead rider drew up at the edge of the customs hall's lamplight, and Lunara Vale stood in the doorway with no seal and no garrison and no empire behind her, and waited. The lead rider pulled his horse up hard at the edge of the lamplight, and the animal blew steam into the night air, and Lunara did not step back. She stood in the doorway of the customs hall with her hands loose at her sides and her weight balanced, and she looked at the rider the way she looked at everything that arrived unexpected and armed, the way you look at math you haven't solved yet. 23 riders. Valdur Standard, the red and black scorpion crest, Southern military formation, not a diplomatic envoys arrangement. Too fast, too tight. No herald's flag at the front. Not an invitation. Not a threat either, or they would have come dark. Something in between. "Luna Vale," the lead rider said. He was maybe 35, professional bearing, a lieutenant's rank markers on his chest armor. Not someone sent to negotiate and not someone sent to kill. Someone sent to retrieve. "By order of Emperor Sirath Valdur of the Southern Reaches." "Former Luna," she said. "And I don't take orders from the Southern Reaches." "The Emperor requests, where's his seal?" A pause. The lieutenant reached into his coat and produced a document, leaned down from the horse to offer it. She stepped forward into the cold and took it without looking away from him first, then looked down. The seal was real. She had spent enough time in treaty rooms to know a forgery, and this wasn't one. The wax crest, the pressed mark of the Valdur dynasty. The document itself was short. Not a legal summons, not a threat, not a formal request in the diplomatic register. It was a personal letter. 3 lines in a handwriting she didn't recognize. "You have been discarded by a fool. I do not discard useful things. Come south." She read it twice. She handed it back. "Tell your emperor I'm not a useful thing," she said. "I'm a person, and I don't travel south on 3 sentences and a midnight visit." The lieutenant didn't move. "He expected you might say that." He reached again into his coat. This time it was a second document, longer, sealed with a different mark. Administrative, not royal. "He also sent this." She took it, unrolled it in the lamplight. It was a resource allocation list. Valor's eastern border positions, troop deployments, supply chain routing through the Ember Straits. Intelligence. Detailed, recent, accurate. She could tell it was accurate because it matched the calculation she'd made herself based on observable troop movements she'd noted before she left. She felt the thing she always felt when someone showed her a card that cost them something to play. The cold, precise awareness that she was being treated as an asset worth buying. The Emperor hadn't sent flattery. He'd sent proof of his intelligence network and an implicit offer of its use, smarter than vain. She gave him that. "You rode 23 men through 400 miles of waste to deliver paperwork," she said. "We rode 23 men because the waste is not empty," the lieutenant said. He glanced past her at the customs hall, the lamplight, the sound of movement inside where her people were doing exactly what she'd told them to do. Quiet, fast, nothing readable if it came to that. "The Emperor is aware of what you have begun here. He considers it of significant interest." She held his gaze. "What does he want?" "An alliance, independent of Valor. He wants the Ashen Dominion, his word, not ours. He has been watching longer than you might assume, operating as a strategic partner on the Eastern Front. free governance, full autonomy, access to southern trade routes and materiel supply. And in exchange, your expertise, your presence at key negotiations, and the lieutenant paused with the timing of someone delivering the part of the message he'd been told to frame carefully. Intelligence on Valor's internal structure. What you know. What you built. The architecture. The architecture. The phrase sat in her chest like a splinter. She had built it. 6 years of administrative systems, the governing framework of 11 provinces, the supply chain mathematics that kept 3 million people fed through 2 consecutive drought seasons. She had built it, and she knew it better than anyone alive. And Sirath Valdor knew she knew it, and he was offering her a future in exchange for a detailed map of everything she'd given to a man who had publicly discarded her. She looked at the document in her hand, the troop positions, the supply routes. She thought about Merrick Vane's satisfied expression on the palace steps. She thought about the eastern tributary bottleneck, and the 2 farming districts losing spring planting, and the fact that Kyle would implement whatever fix he got around to eventually, probably inadequately, because the person who had identified the actual problem was now standing in a ruined customs hall in the eastern waste at midnight. She thought about what Vark had said. "You're building something serious. Tell your emperor I'll meet with his delegation," she said. "Here, on my ground, in 4 days. He sends 3 representatives with full negotiating authority and no military escort." He anticipated a counter. He anticipated correctly. 4 days, 3 people. No soldiers. The lieutenant studied her for a moment. The horse shifted under him. "Agreed," he said. She stepped back into the doorway. "Then we're done for tonight." She watched them turn and ride back into the dark, the torchlight dwindling, and she stood in the cold until she couldn't hear hoofbeats anymore. Then she went back inside. "Southern Emperor," Vark said. He wasn't asking. "Yes. That's either the best thing that's happened to us, or the worst." "It's neither yet," she said. She moved back to the planning table, back to the routing problem she'd been working on, and she stood over it without sitting down because she needed to keep her body in motion while her mind worked the new information in. "Get Harlan and Drea. I need them in here. It's midnight. I know what time it is." He went and got them. They came in rumpled and sharp-eyed. People who had learned to wake up functional because the alternative was waking up slow, and slow had costs. Drea had her hair down for the first time Lunara had seen, which made her look younger and harder simultaneously. Harlan was still pulling on his coat. "Southern delegation in 4 days," Lunara said. "Sirath Valdor wants an alliance. Materiel, trade access, intelligence on Valor in exchange for autonomy and political partnership." Harlan said, "Intelligence on Valor? Yes. That's the part that costs something." "Yes." Drea said, "What does he think you know?" "Everything," Lunara said. "He's right." The room was quiet for a moment. The maps on the walls looked the same as they had 10 minutes ago, but the weight of them had shifted. This was no longer a survival project. This was the first moment it became possible for it to be something else, and all 3 of them could feel that, and the feeling was not simple. "The moment you give Valdor internal architecture on Valor," Harlan said carefully, "you are not a neutral party anymore. You are in a conflict between 2 empires." "I'm already not neutral," she said. "Kyle made that decision when he dissolved my position publicly and drove me into the waste. I didn't choose the sides. The sides chose me." She looked at each of them in turn. "What I'm choosing is what I build here, and I will not let what I build here get swallowed by Valdor any more than I'll let it get swallowed by Valor. I'm meeting his delegation to find out what he actually wants and what he's willing to hold back." "How do you know he'll hold anything back?" Drea said. "Because he sent intelligence on Valor's troop positioning as a good faith gift and not as leverage. That means he's capable of choosing to show instead of threaten. That means he's negotiating honestly, at least at this stage. I can work with honest negotiation," Vark said from the doorway where he'd been leaning, quiet. "Or he's showing you what he wants you to think his approach is." She looked at him. "Yes, that too. Which is why I take 4 days, and I spend those 4 days figuring out what he knows about us and where he got it, and what that tells me about how much he actually sees." She sat down. She picked up her charcoal. Water routing, she said. We're still solving the water routing tonight. The delegation changes nothing about the foundation work. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Harlan pulled out his stool and sat across from her and looked at the routing problem she'd been working on. Drea went back to her own table. Vark pushed off the doorframe. The planning room went back to work. Hot. 4 days. She slept 3 hours a night and used the rest. She sent Hess to 3 of the outer settlements with specific questions about Southern trader contact, who had come through, what they'd wanted, how recently. The answers came back in pieces over 2 days. Southern merchants had been moving through the waste trade paths for 8 months, longer than she'd been in the territories, asking about population density and technical skill concentrations. Valdor hadn't just noticed the Ashen Dominion after she built it. He'd been watching the waste for assets before she arrived, and her arrival had apparently accelerated his interest considerably. That told her 2 things. 1, he had a strategy for the Eastern Territories that predated her and into which he was being inserted as an upgrade. 2, the assets he'd cataloged before her, Harlan's Bridge, Solt's road repairs, Vark's settlement, had value to him independent of what she knew about Valor. The intelligence on Valor was the centerpiece of his offer, but the foundation of his interest was the people she'd already organized. She wrote this down. She added it to the map. On the 3rd night, she couldn't sleep at all. She lay on her bedroll in the back room of the customs hall and looked at the ceiling and let herself do the thing she had been carefully not doing, which was think about Kael. Not with grief. Or not only with grief. With the same analytical precision she brought to everything, because the thing with Kael was no longer just a personal wound. It was now a geopolitical variable. The man she had built an empire beside was about to marry into the Southern dynasty. He had dissolved her position to enable that marriage, and the Southern Emperor apparently was recruiting her. She thought about what Kael would do when he found out. She knew what he would do. She knew how he thought. She had spent 6 years inside his decision-making process, and she knew that he would see this as a threat. Her, the territories, the Ashen Dominion, the Southern contact, as a knife being assembled one piece at a time in his eastern flank. He would not be wrong, and his response would be deliberate and patient, and when it came, total. He was not a reactive king. That was one of the things She stopped herself, filed it, moved on. The delegation arrived on schedule. 3 men, no military escort, 2 horses, and a mule. She respected the compliance. The lead negotiator was a man named Aldrich Cass, maybe 50, with a diplomat's careful blankness and the particular tiredness of someone who has been conducting high-stakes negotiations for decades and has long since stopped finding them interesting. He was competent. She could tell in the first 30 seconds. Beside him was a younger man, mid-30s, who was introduced as a resource assessor and who spent the entire first 10 minutes looking at the maps on the walls with an expression of barely contained professional interest. The third was a woman who said almost nothing and wrote everything down. Lunara sat across the planning table from Aldrich Cass and did not offer pleasantries. "Your emperor wants intelligence on Valor's administrative architecture," she said. "What specifically?" Cass tilted his head slightly. "Most people opened with something softer. Supply chain vulnerabilities, provincial loyalty structures, the internal division between the military command and the noble council." "That division is not internal," she said. "It's structural. It was structural before I arrived, and it will outlast Kael Dravenheart's reign unless someone redesigns the council charter, which nobody will do because the people who would have to approve the redesign are the ones who benefit from the current structure." She paused. "That's worth more than what I just told you about troop positions, and I gave it to you for free. Now tell me what you're actually asking for." Cass studied her. "The Emperor wants to know," he said, with slightly less diplomatic smoothness than before, "whether Valor can survive a prolonged war on 2 fronts if the Southern campaign is reopened." The room was very quiet. "He's considering breaking the treaty," she said. "He is considering his options." "The treaty he just finalized, the one that required Kael to publicly discard me and bind himself to the Valdur line." She felt something cold and exact move through her chest. Not rage, not satisfaction, something more dangerous than both. He made the treaty to weaken Kael politically And now he's asking me whether Kyle is weak enough. Cass said nothing, which was its own answer. She looked at the resource assessor, who was still looking at the maps. She looked at the silent woman writing. She looked at Cass. "Tell me something," she said. "Your emperor. He is intelligent, clearly. His intelligence network is better than I assumed. He understands long-term positioning." She leaned forward slightly. "What does he think I will do if I tell him Valor is vulnerable, and he breaks the treaty and marches north and burns through the empire I spent 6 years building? He believes you have sufficient reason to. He believes I will help him destroy it because Kyle hurt me." Her voice was flat. "He believes this is a revenge transaction." Cass was quiet. "Your emperor is smart," she said, "and he is wrong about what motivates me." She sat back. "I did not build those systems to own them. I built them because 3 million people need functioning grain distribution and water access and provincial governance that doesn't collapse the moment someone with a bloodline decides they want more land. Those people are still there. They didn't vote for what happened on those palace steps. I will not give anyone information that gets them killed." The room held the weight of that for a moment. "Then," Cass said carefully, "what will you give?" She looked at him. "I will give your emperor something worth more than a military vulnerability map," she said. "I will give him what I'm building here. The actual architecture, not Valor's, mine. The Ashen Dominion's governing structure, the resource framework, the trade routes I've identified, the population base I've organized. As a partner, not as intelligence, as a model. The Emperor wants leverage over Valor. The Emperor wants stability on his northern border so he can focus his resources elsewhere. I know what he wants because I've read his troop positioning and his expansion pattern over the last 6 years, and his actual strategic interest is the eastern sea routes, not the northern plains." She held Cass's gaze. "Tell him I will build a buffer civilization between his empire and Valor's that is independently functional, internally stable, and deeply uninterested in being conquered by either side. Tell him that is worth more than a war he might win slowly and at enormous cost." Cass studied her for a long moment. The resource assessor had stopped looking at the maps and was now looking at her. The silent woman's pen had paused. "I will convey this to the Emperor," Cass said. "Tell him something else," she said. "Tell him that if he moves against Valor before I have completed the first phase of Ashen Dominion infrastructure, I will share his approach strategy with Valor's military command in enough detail to make the campaign catastrophically expensive. Not because I love Cale Dravenheart. Because I will not let a war happen in territory where I have people." The silence in the room was the particular silence of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew about a meeting. "You're negotiating against both empires simultaneously," Cass said. "I'm protecting what I'm building," she said. "Those aren't the same thing. Yet." Yes. The delegation left before dark. Vark found her at the river an hour later, sitting on the same broken dock where she'd had her 10 minutes of grief 6 weeks ago. He sat down beside her without asking, and they were quiet for a while. "You told Valdor's man you'd warn Kyle if he moved against the Empire," Vark said. "Yes." "You'd warn the man who—" "I'd warn 3 million people who live in the Empire's territories," she said. "Kyle is incidental." Vark was quiet for a moment. The river moved past them in the dark. "Cass is going to report back that you're unpredictable," he said. "Good. Unpredictable is safe. Lunara." His voice had a weight in it. "You drew a line with a Southern Emperor tonight. If he crosses it, you have to be willing to actually warn Valor, which means making contact with Valor, which means— I know what it means." "Do you?" She looked at the river. She thought about everything she'd built in 6 weeks from nothing. The map, the people, the water routing now half solved, the salt flat operation Drea was organizing, Harlan's bridge project that had become a road project that had become a 3-district infrastructure plan. She thought about all the things she had still to build. She thought about what it would cost if Valdor decided her counteroffer wasn't sufficient and moved anyway. "I know what it means," she said again, quietly. "It means the first time I make contact with Kyle Dravenheart after what he did, it will be to save his empire." Vark said nothing. She looked at the dark water. I need that not to be funny, she said. He almost said something. He stopped himself. From the direction of the customs hall came the sound of Harlan's voice calling for someone, the ordinary noise of people working late on something that needed doing, and Lunara sat on the broken dock with the river moving past and understood, with the full weight of it, that she had just made herself into a variable that neither empire had accounted for, and that in 3 weeks, when the first Ashen Dominion grain surplus came in, and Vark's settlement formally registered under her governance charter, and the Eastern Road Network reached its first junction, she would be a variable that neither empire could afford to ignore. She stood up. She went back to work. She did not see the rider watching from the tree line on the far bank. Valdor's scout, left behind when the delegation departed, still and silent in the dark. She did not see the message he would carry south before dawn. She did not see the second rider further back, flying no colors, who had been watching not the delegation but Lunara herself for 4 days, and who turned his horse west toward Vialor before the first rider had finished crossing the river. 3 months after the Valdur delegation rode back south, the Ashen Dominion had its first surplus. Not large, not the kind of surplus that made empires. 42 tons of preserved grain from the newly irrigated eastern fields, 16 barrels of rendered salt from the flat operation Drea had organized, and enough quarried granite staged at the road junction to complete the first permanent bridge on the northern route. But it was real, accounted for, documented in Lunara's handwriting in a ledger that now had 40 pages of entries, and the fact of it, a surplus where 3 months ago there had been nothing, meant that the mathematics had changed. She was standing in the grain storage they'd converted from a ruined way station when Hess found her. "Rider from the west," Hess said. "No colors. He asked for you by name." Lunara set down the ledger. "Alone?" "Came alone. Left his horse at the outer post. Walked in." Hess paused. "He's Valor military, not recent, the way he moves. But the coat is civilian." She knew, before she saw him, what category of person he was. Former military and civilian clothes asking for her by name after weeks of no contact from the empire she'd left. Not a threat and not a diplomat. A messenger who wasn't supposed to exist officially. He was maybe 40, lean, with the contained stillness of a man trained to wait without fidgeting. He stood in the outer yard with his hands visible and his weight easy, and he watched her cross the yard without moving. "Luna Vale," he said. "I'm not Luna anything," she said. "What do you want?" He reached into his coat and produced a letter, sealed with a mark she recognized. Not the royal seal, not official correspondence. A personal mark. The small wolf's head that Kael used on private communications when he didn't want the correspondence logged through the palace registry. She had seen that mark on letters slid under her study door at 2 a.m. when Kael had thought of something about the Harthen negotiations that couldn't wait until dawn. She had probably received 30 letters with that mark over 6 years, and she recognized it the way you recognize a handwriting or a voice, involuntarily and precisely. She did not reach for it immediately. "Who sent you?" she said. "You know who sent me." "I want you to say it." "The Alpha King." He held her gaze. "He says read it before you decide whether to burn it." She took the letter. She did not open it in front of the messenger. She walked back inside to the planning room, to the table with the maps and the ledger and the routing problems and the 40 pages of documented surplus. She set it on the table. She looked at it for a moment, the seal, the familiar mark, and then she opened it. The handwriting was Kael's, compressed, forward-leaning, the writing of a man who thought faster than he wrote and was always slightly impatient with the pace of documentation. It said, "I know what you're building. I know about the Valdur contact. The rider you didn't see was mine. I am not writing to reclaim anything or to threaten what you've made. I am writing because Merrick Vane has been in direct correspondence with Sirath Valdur for 11 months, not since the treaty, before it. The marriage was Vane's architecture from the beginning, not a response to Valdur's position. I have proof. I need you to know because what happens next in the East will happen to your people before it reaches mine, and you deserve to see it coming. Burn this after. K." She read it 3 times. She did not burn it. She set it on the table and she sat down and she looked at it and she felt the specific kind of anger that is not hot but cold and structural. The anger of someone who has correctly analyzed a system only to discover the system was more compromised than the analysis accounted for. Not wrong, insufficient. Vane had been in contact with Valdur for 11 months, before the treaty, which meant the treaty was not a response to Valdur's military positioning. The positioning was a tool Vane had coordinated, or at minimum leveraged, to produce the outcome he wanted, which meant Kyle had made his calculation: empire over everything, structure over feeling, the long term over the immediate cost, based on a threat that had been manufactured by the man who stood to benefit from it. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up the letter, folded it, and put it in her coat. She brought Vark, Andrea, and Harlan into the planning room, and she told them what the letter said without showing it to them because some information was hers to hold and hers to decide how to use. Vark said, "Vane and Valdur, together, for almost a year." If the letter's accurate. Is it? She thought about Kyle's handwriting, the compressed forward lean of it, the lack of preamble or justification or explanation, the 7 words that had cost him something to write. "You deserve to see it coming." "Yes," she said. "Then what's coming," Harlan said, "is not the treaty breaking. The treaty was never the real structure. Vane has been building something, and Valdur has been helping him build it, and the question is what it is." "Valdur wants the eastern sea routes," Lunara said. "I told his delegation that. If Vane has been helping position him—" She stopped. She worked it. The routing problem, but political. The structural failure, but in a governing system instead of a watershed. She stood up and went to the map. "Vane wants Kyle weak," she said. "He's been engineering that. The marriage weakens Kyle internally because half the noble houses see a southern alliance as a capitulation. Valdur gets Saris installed as empress, which gives him a direct line into the palace power structure. And at some point, some specifically chosen point, Valdur moves. Not to conquer Valor, to fracture it. Separate the eastern provinces from the central empire, because the eastern provinces are what sit between Valdur's territory and the sea routes. The room was quiet. "And the eastern provinces," Drea said slowly, "are what sit directly against our northern border." "Yes." "We're not in the path of a war," Vark said. "We're in the path of a reorganization. He doesn't want to burn the east. He wants to absorb it." "And we're already here," Harlan said. "Already organized. Already building infrastructure that makes absorption easier." Lunara looked at the map. 400 miles of territory she had spent 3 months converting from abandoned waste into something functional. The grain surplus. The salt operation. The road network. The 40 pages of documented progress. She had built Sirath Valdur an administrative gift and delivered it directly into his strategic interest zone. She had known his game was longer than the delegation offered. She had not known it was this long. "How much time do we have?" Vark said. "I don't know," she said. "Kyle doesn't say when. He may not know when." She looked at the letter's final line again in her memory. "What happens next in the East will happen to your people before it reaches mine." Her people. She spent 2 days working the problem from every angle, and on the 3rd day she made a decision she had been circling for weeks, and she sent the messenger back west with a reply. The reply said, "I need to meet with you, not at the palace, not under any Valor protocol. On the border road at the Eastern Garrison Relay, 3 days from now, with no council members present and no record of the meeting. If you cannot agree to those terms, do not come." She did not sign it with a title. She signed it with her name. She gave herself 1 hour to think about what it meant that she was doing this, and then she stopped thinking about it and went back to the water routing. He came alone. She had not entirely believed he would, had not believed he could, given the political architecture of his current position, the council's surveillance, the new alliance obligations. But he came alone on a gray horse with no insignia, and he arrived at the relay station at dawn, which was earlier than she'd specified, which meant he had been riding since before dark, which meant he had left without wanting anyone to see him leave. She was already there. She had come from the east. He came from the west. They stood in the empty relay station yard with dawn light coming flat and colorless through the clouds, and 12 feet of packed dirt between them. He looked like a man who had not slept well for 3 months. He looked like himself, which was worse than if he'd looked diminished or changed. He looked exactly like the person she knew, with the evidence of cost in the set of his face and the lines around his eyes and the jaw that was doing the lockdown thing. She had thought she was ready for this. She had been wrong about being ready. "Thank you for coming," she said, because she had to start somewhere, and she had decided in advance that she was not going to open with anger, not because the anger wasn't real, but because anger would waste time they didn't have. "I didn't think you'd answer," he said. His voice was the same. She had forgotten, or had tried to forget, how precise her memory of his voice was. "I almost didn't." He nodded. He looked at her. Not the raking, evaluating look of an alpha assessing a situation, but the look of someone trying to see if something they need to see is still there, and she saw that, and she made herself stay with it rather than deflecting. "The letter," she said. "The proof about Vane. I need everything you have." "I brought it." He reached into his coat and produced a document case, walked forward to offer it. She stepped forward to take it. For a moment they were close enough that she could see the specific detail of his face, the tiredness behind his eyes, the faint scar along his jaw from the border campaign in his second year as king, the ink stain on his left thumb that meant he'd been writing through the night recently. She took the case. She stepped back. "Is it enough to act on?" she said. "For a formal proceeding? No. For understanding what Vane has built, yes. He's been routing Valdor's intelligence agents through our Eastern trade inspection posts for 9 months. The inspectors on record are his appointments. The correspondence goes through coded merchant logs." He paused. "I didn't see it because I wasn't looking for it. I trusted the wrong architecture." There it was, the thing he could not say easily and had said anyway, the words landing with the particular weight of a man admitting a structural failure in himself. "You trusted the architecture because I built most of it and you knew it was sound," she said. "Vane knew that too. He didn't corrupt the architecture I built. He built parallel to it, underneath it, where my systems wouldn't catch it because my systems were designed to manage honest governance." "Yes. That's not a comfort to me," she said, "but it's accurate." "Lunara, not yet." Her voice came out steady. "We do the work first, then whatever else." He stopped. He accepted that. They stood in the relay station yard for the next 2 hours with the document case open on the relay post table and went through Vane's network piece by piece. It was the most familiar thing she had done in 3 months, standing beside him, working a problem, both of their minds moving on the same material. It was also the most painful thing she had done in 3 months, for exactly the same reason. The picture that emerged from Vane's documents was precise and ugly. He had been building toward a moment. The documents didn't specify when, but the infrastructure pointed toward a trigger event, in which Valdor would make a military move against the eastern provinces under a pretext Vane would manufacture internally. The Valor military command, fragmented by the noble house divisions Vane had been deepening for years, would fail to respond cohesively. The eastern provinces would fall within 1 campaigning season. Kael would be left holding a diminished empire with a southern empress who reported to her father and a council that had engineered his defeat. Vane did not want Valor destroyed. He wanted it reduced to a size he could actually control. Kael's face, as they worked through the last of the documents, was the particular blankness of a person processing a betrayal at foundational depth. Not surprise, because a man with his threat assessment couldn't claim surprise, but the specific shock of seeing the shape of what someone close to you has spent years building against you. The shape of it, the patience of it. "He's been in my council for 17 years, Kael said. Quietly. Not to her exactly, to the fact of it. "I know. He was my father's chancellor. I know. I gave him the Eastern inspection appointments because you told me his recommendations were technically sound." She felt that land. He wasn't blaming her. His voice had the tone of someone completing an accounting, not assigning fault. But she felt it anyway, the specific weight of her own work having been the vehicle for part of this. Honest governance built on top of a corrupt foundation. Her systems couldn't catch what they weren't designed to see. "When does he move?" she said. "I don't know. The trigger event isn't specified in anything I found." It doesn't need to be specified, she said. Vane doesn't need a predetermined trigger. He needs a moment of maximum instability. He'll recognize it when it arrives and use it. Then we have to remove him before it arrives. You can't remove him through the council. He has the votes. You remove him through the council, and you lose the council, and Valdur gets his fracture event handed to him without having to manufacture one. Then what? Kyle said. I can't move against my own chancellor without council authority? You can't, she said. I'm not subject to your council. She looked at him directly for the first time since they'd started working. Your Eastern inspection posts, the ones Vane staffed, they are physically in territory adjacent to Ashen Dominion borders. The air in the relay yard was very still. I have standing to investigate trade interference on my border, she said. I have documentation of Valdur's agents moving through those posts. I have administrative authority in the Eastern Territories that predates your council's current composition, established through the original Harthan provincial framework, which Vane never fully invalidated because he didn't realize I'd written the charter broadly enough to extend eastward. Kale was looking at her. You planned for this. I planned for needing legal ground that wasn't dependent on your council's good faith, because I understood Vane's intentions before I left, even if I didn't understand the full scope. She held his gaze. I did not plan for needing to use it against a Valdur coordinated action. That part is new. What do you need from me? She held the weight of that question. What did she need from him? The list was long, and most of it had nothing to do with the geopolitical situation, and she was not going to touch any of that today. I need your military command to be ready to move east on my signal without council approval, she said. Specifically, I need Commander Aldenmere if he's still loyal to you personally rather than to the council structure. Aldenmere is mine. Then I need a 3-week window in which Vane believes nothing has changed. I need you to go back to that palace and sit at that council table and give him no indication that you have seen these documents. She watched him process that. 3 weeks of sitting across a table from a man who had spent 17 years building a cage around him and performing normal. And you, he said, what are you doing in those 3 weeks? I'm going to find Vane's trigger, she said, the event he's waiting for, and I'm going to arrange for it to happen on my timeline instead of his. She closed the document case. She held it out to him. He took it. Their hands did not touch. Lunara. His voice had that edge on it again. The edge she had heard on the plaza steps, the fracture at the rim of controlled sound. When this is done? 3 weeks, she said. We get through 3 weeks first. She turned and walked east. She had made it 30 feet when she heard him say quietly, to her back, I'm sorry. For the steps. For all of it. She stopped walking. She stood still for a moment with the flat dawn light on her face and her hands at her sides. She did not turn around. I know you are, she said. She kept walking. She had 12 miles back to the customs hall and 3 weeks to find a trigger that Merrick Vane had hidden somewhere in the eastern trade infrastructure. And she was already working the problem before the relay station was out of sight. She was already thinking about the inspection post records and the merchant log codes and the specific pattern of Valdur's agent movements that would tell her what event Vane was waiting for. She was thinking clearly and working the problem, and she did not let herself feel anything else until she was well out of sight of the relay station. And then, briefly, in the way she had learned, with a precise limit on it, she let herself feel all of it. The familiar weight of his voice, the tiredness in his face, the ink on his thumb, the 7 words on the letter she was still carrying in her coat. You deserve to see it coming. She gave herself a mile. 1 mile, walking east through the cold morning, for everything that wasn't strategy. Then she squared her shoulders and she went back to being the person who was going to solve this. She did not see the inspection post guard 30 miles north who had already sent a coded log entry to a merchant contact in the capital. She did not see the merchant contact, who was one of Vane's people, add a notation to his ledger. She did not see the notation. It said, contact confirmed. Subject moving against network. Accelerate timeline. The trigger Vane had been waiting for was not an event he needed to recognize. It was her. Vane moved on the 9th day. Not the 3rd week Lunara had asked for. Not the timeline she had calculated based on the document patterns and the agent movements and the logic of a man who preferred slow architecture over fast violence. 9 days, which meant the inspection postcard's coded notation had reached him faster than she'd anticipated, and Vane had looked at the information, subject moving against network, and decided that a controlled acceleration was safer than waiting for her to finish finding what she was looking for. He was not wrong. The problem was that she had found it on day 7. She was at the Eastern Road Junction, 3 miles from the customs hall, reviewing the final section of the merchant log codes with Solt when Vark came at a hard run. "Valor columns," he said. He was breathing fast but not panicked. The controlled urgency of a man who has run toward bad news instead of away from it. 3 of them, moving east on the northern road, flying council colors, not royal. Aldenmuir's garrison insignia is not on any of them. Council colors. Not Kale. "How far out?" she said. 6 hours. Maybe 5. She looked at Solt. He looked back at her with the expression of a man doing the same arithmetic she was doing and arriving at the same answer. "Get everyone to the customs hall," she said. "Everything on the walls comes down and gets packed. The ledgers, the maps, the surplus documentation. Nothing stays that tells them what we've built." Lunara, "Move," she said. She was already walking. She sent the signal to Kael before she did anything else, because the signal to Kael was the piece that everything else depended on. Aldenmuir needed to move east, and he needed to move in the next 4 hours, which meant Kael needed to receive the message and make the decision before Vane's columns reached the junction. She had one rider fast enough to make that distance in time, and his name was a young man from Vark's settlement named Corin, who had grown up in the saddle and who she had identified 3 weeks ago as the fastest asset she had for exactly this kind of contingency. She wrote the message in 30 seconds. It said, "Now, Eastern Road, all 3 columns. I need Aldenmuir moving in 4 hours, or there is nothing to save." She gave it to Corin, and she watched him ride west, and then she turned back to the problem. Chunk. 5 hours. She had 5 hours and approximately 200 people who had built their lives around a framework she had assembled from nothing in 3 months, and she had to decide in the next 20 minutes how to spend those 5 hours in a way that didn't end with Vane's council soldiers dismantling everything and arresting her people on whatever manufactured charge Vane had prepared. She did not run. She had thought about running, moving the entire operation further east, deeper into the waste, buying time through distance. She had thought about it, and she had rejected it because distance without resolution was not safety, it was postponement. Vane would follow. Valdur would close from the south. The Ashen Dominion would be squeezed between 2 advancing forces on ground that had no natural defensive value. She needed ground, real ground, the kind that came from legitimacy, not distance. She had the Eastern Inspection Post documentation. She had Vane's network mapped. She had 7 days of evidence she'd gathered since the relay station meeting that showed specific Valor administrative corruption in the Eastern Territories, corruption that gave her formal standing under the Harthan provincial charter she'd written broadly enough to extend eastward. She had 32 pages of documentation that could bring Vane down, if it reached the right hands before his columns reached her. She went to the customs hall, and she found Harlan and Drea and Vark, and she put the 32 pages on the table. "I need a courier to the northern noble houses," she said. "Not Valor capital, the houses. Aldenmuir's family seat. The Brenner holdings on the northern plateau. 3 other houses that have been quietly opposed to Vane's council consolidation for years, but haven't had grounds to move." She looked at Vark. "I need 3 separate riders, 3 separate routes, within the hour." "We have riders," Vark said. "What am I sending?" "Evidence of Vane's correspondence with Valdur, evidence of the inspection post network, evidence that the Southern Treaty was manufactured to weaken the East." She looked at the pages. "And a formal claim of Eastern territorial sovereignty under the Harthan Charter, which means those noble houses, if they want to oppose Vane's council consolidation legally, have a framework to do it through. A legitimate entity in the Eastern Territories that is not subject to council authority." Drea said, "You're asking the northern houses to back the Ashen Dominion against the council." "I'm giving the northern houses a legal and strategic reason to do something they already want to do," Lunara said. "That's different from asking." Harlan looked at the pages. And if Aldenmere doesn't arrive in time? She looked at him. She let the silence hold the answer for a moment, because the answer was that if Aldenmere didn't arrive in time, she would be standing in the Eastern Road Junction with 200 people and no military force when 3 council columns pulled up, and the documentation she was sending to the noble houses would matter considerably less if she was not present and functional to prosecute the claim it established. Then we make them pay for every foot of this road, she said. Everything we've built here is worth defending, not because it's mine, because the people in it are real and the work is real, and nobody is burning it without a cost they didn't plan for. Vark said, I'll get the riders. Berashi di Basambashi. She had 2 hours before the columns reached visible range when she went to the outer post and looked west and let herself think about Kael receiving the message. She ran the variables. He was in the palace. He was sitting across a council table from Vane, performing normal, which meant he could not respond to her signal with any visible preparation without confirming to Vane that they had been in contact. He would have to move quietly, find Aldenmere, communicate orders through back channels, get a force moving east without tipping anything in the council chamber. She had seen him work fast under constraint before. She knew what he was capable of, but 9 days instead of 3 weeks had cut the preparation time by more than half, and she had no way of knowing if Corin had gotten through or how Kael was positioned when the message arrived, or whether Aldenmere could assemble and move in 4 hours from a cold start. She had done everything she could do from her side. She went back to the customs hall, and she picked up her own coat and her own knife, and she thought, with the particular clarity of someone who has accepted a bad variable and moved past it. If Aldenmere doesn't come, then I find another way. She had always found another way. Every time the structure had failed her, she had found another way, and she would find another way now, and the fact that she was standing in the eastern waste with 200 people and 3 months of built work and no army was not a novel situation. It was just Tuesday, and she had survived all the other Tuesdays. The first column came into sight at the northern road junction at late afternoon, the light going flat and gray and cold. Council colors, red and gold, military formation, approximately 80 soldiers in the lead group. Behind them, further back, she could see the dust of the other 2 columns. She was standing at the junction with Vark on her left and Harlan on her right, and approximately 40 of her people arranged behind her in a way that was not military, but was not nothing either. People who had been building things and protecting those things for 3 months, and who had, apparently, decided to stand in a line when it came to it. She had not told them to do that. They had done it. The column commander pulled up at 50 feet. He was maybe 45, professional, the face of a man executing orders he understood without necessarily agreeing with them. He looked at the line of people behind her. He looked at her. Lunara Vale, he said. By authority of the High Council of Vaelor, you are directed to cease operations in the Eastern Territories and submit to council jurisdiction for investigation of unauthorized governance activity. She said, under what charter provision? He blinked. He had not expected the question to be legal. The council has authority over all. The Harthan Provincial Charter, Extended Eastern Provision, establishes an independent administrative zone in the territories beyond the Empire's eastern boundary marker. She kept her voice level. The Ashen Dominion is constituted under that provision. Council jurisdiction does not extend to independent administrative zones without the Alpha King's direct authorization. Do you have that authorization in writing? The commander looked at the document in his hand. He looked at her. The council has determined, I need the Alpha King's seal, she said. If you have it, show it to me. If you don't, you are operating outside legal authority in a territory where I have administrative standing. Behind the first column, the second was pulling up. She could see a senior officer at the front of the second column, better armored, the bearing of someone with actual command authority. He was watching this exchange. The senior officer rode forward. He was not someone she recognized, which meant he was Vane's direct appointment. Older, mid-50s, the particular heaviness of a man who has been given power he is not worried about abusing. This is not a legal proceeding, he said. He looked at her with the flat dismissiveness of someone who has decided in advance how this conversation ends. You will stand aside, or your people will be removed. She looked at him. She thought about 32 pages of documentation riding north on 3 separate routes. She thought about Corin, who had been riding west for 5 hours. She thought about Aldenmuir's garrison and the 4-hour window. She thought about the particular clarity she had found on the broken dock at the river 3 months ago, when she had looked at everything she had and what she could do with it. The clean, cold pull of a problem she could solve. "My people will not be removed," she said. He said, "You have nothing to back that with." "I have documentation of Merrick Vane's 11-month correspondence with Emperor Surath Valdur of the Southern Reaches, including evidence of coordinated intelligence operations conducted through Vailor's eastern inspection posts." She watched his face. She saw the flicker, quick, controlled, but there. He knew. Of course he knew. He was Vane's man. That documentation is currently en route to 6 separate recipients across the northern province. In approximately 12 hours, it will be in the hands of people who have the standing and the motivation to act on it. She held his gaze. "So when you talk about what I have to back this with, consider what you have to lose if this goes forward the wrong way." The silence was enormous. Vark was breathing steady beside her. She could feel Harlan's stillness on her right. The senior officer looked at her with the reassessing expression of a man recalculating a situation he thought was already solved. Then his face closed down. "Take her." The soldiers moved. Mkets. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not organized resistance. It was people who had been building things for 3 months and had decided without discussion or instruction that they were not going to step aside for the men who had come to take those things away. Harlan put himself in front of 2 soldiers with the calm of a man who has been doing physical work his entire life and is not afraid of his own body. Vark moved with the precision of a former military commander, which meant he moved economically, and he moved first. The line behind her became a physical wall, not fighting, exactly, but not moving. And 40 people who are not moving are not 40 people. They are a problem in logistics and optics, because you can move 40 people, but you cannot move them quietly or without cost. Lunara did not move. The soldier who reached her stopped 2 feet away because she was standing absolutely still, looking directly at him with an expression that was not defiance and was not fear and was not anything he had a trained response to. Just a person looking at him from a fixed point, clear-eyed and present, and entirely unwilling to pretend this was normal. He put his hand on her arm. She did not pull away. She looked at the senior officer over the soldier's shoulder. "You will want to think," she said, "about what this looks like in writing, what it looks like when the documentation arrives. A council force arresting the administrator of an independent territory who is standing on her own ground with no weapons and her people around her." She paused. "Vane has been very careful about what he puts in writing. You should be equally careful about what you do in front of 40 witnesses." The senior officer's jaw was tight. He knew she was right. He also had orders. He opened his mouth. The sound came from the north, not from the west, where Aldenmuir would have come from. From the north, where she had sent 3 riders to 3 noble houses, and where apparently one of those noble houses had been closer and faster and more motivated than she had calculated. 200 horses. Brenner colors, the black and silver of the northern plateau, moving in military formation down the junction road, and at the front of them a man she had never met in person, but whose family seat she had included in the Harthen Eastern provision because she had read the political landscape carefully 3 months ago, and identified the Brenner house as the most likely to act if they had legal standing to do so. The senior officer's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession. The Brenner commander pulled up beside the council columns and looked at the standoff, the arrested woman, the council soldiers, the 40 people refusing to move, and said to the senior officer, "By what authority are you operating in the Harthen Extended Eastern Zone?" The council soldier's hand dropped from Lunara's arm. She breathed. She was still breathing when the Brenner commander dismounted and walked to her and said quietly, "I received your documentation 4 hours ago. I have been writing since." "I didn't know if you'd come," she said. "You gave us legal ground." He looked at her with the direct assessment of a military man evaluating an asset. "We've been waiting 3 years for legal ground." She looked at the senior officer. He was calculating. 1 council force, 200 Brenner cavalry, 40 people with 3 months of built loyalty on their own ground, and documentation in transit to 5 other recipients. She watched him run the math, and she watched him arrive at the only answer the math had. "We will withdraw pending clarification of jurisdiction," he said. The words cost him something. She said nothing. She let him have the exit because she needed him to take it. A cornered veins man was useful to nobody. A retreating one gave her 6 more hours. The columns pulled back. She stood at the junction until the dust had settled, and then she sat down on the road because her legs decided they were done holding her up for the moment, which was fine. She could allow that for 30 seconds, and Vark crouched beside her and said nothing, which was the right call. Harlan's voice came from somewhere behind her. "Aldenmuir's coming." She looked west. The dust on the western road was the wrong color for civilian traffic. Military formation, moving fast, and at the front of it the royal insignia, Kyle personal mark, not council colors. Aldenmuir. The king's garrison, authorized by the Alpha King directly, moving east at full speed. 4 hours and 30 minutes. He had missed the window by 30 minutes, which meant the Brenner cavalry had saved her, which meant her 3 weeks of careful political cartography had worked the way she'd built it to work, contingency covering contingency. She looked at the royal insignia on the lead banner getting larger as the column came on. She looked north at the Brenner lines. She looked at the customs hall behind her. The maps, the ledgers, the 40 pages of documentation, the surplus grain, the water routing problem she had half solved, the 40 people who had stood in a line on a road because they had decided that what they were building was worth standing in front of. She thought about Vane still in the capital, still in the council chamber, still sitting across a table from Kyle, performing normal, unaware that his eastern operation had just failed, unaware that the documentation was in 6 sets of hands, unaware that the northern houses were moving. Not finished, not even close to finished. Vane was still operational, and still dangerous, and still had Valder on his side, and still had the council votes, and still had 17 years of architecture built into the palace structure. This was one junction, one afternoon, one narrow outcome that could have gone 3 different ways. But she was still standing. The work was intact. The ground was hers. Aldenmuir pulled up at the junction and dismounted and looked at her, sitting on the road, coat dusty, 32 pages of documentation writing across the north, and he said, "The king said you'd need cavalry." "I needed cavalry 30 minutes ago," she said. "Brenner," he said, looking at the northern lines. "Brenner," she confirmed. He almost smiled. "He's going to want a full report." "He's going to get one." She stood up. She brushed the road dust off her coat. "But first I need your perimeter around this junction, and I need a secure line to the capital, and I need you to tell me if Vane has moved against Kyle directly in the last 5 hours. Aldenmuir's expression shifted, the almost smile gone. "That's why I'm 30 minutes late," he said. "When the king gave me the order and I started moving the garrison, Vane went to the council chamber with an emergency motion, declaring the Alpha King unfit to authorize military operations without council vote." She felt the cold move through her, fast and complete. "Did it pass?" she said. "It was still in session when I rode out." She looked at the western road. She looked at Aldenmuir. She looked at the Brenner commander who had ridden through the night with 200 horses because she had written a charter broadly enough 3 months ago to give him legal standing. She looked at everything she had, the documentation, the allies, the ground, the work, and she understood that she had won a junction and possibly lost a king in the same afternoon, and that the next 12 hours would determine which of those things mattered more. "How fast can your cavalry move?" she said. Aldenmuir said, "Fast." "Then we are not stopping here." She turned to Vark. "Hold this ground. Hold the documentation network. Do not let Vane's columns back onto this road for any reason." She looked at Harlan. "Keep building. Whatever happens in the capital, the work keeps going." She turned to Aldenmuir. "Get me a horse." She was riding west within 10 minutes, Aldenmuir's cavalry around her, the eastern junction behind her and the capital ahead. And somewhere in that capital a council chamber was either delivering a king his empire or taking it from him. And she was going to arrive before the verdict settled into something permanent. She was riding toward the palace she had walked out of 3 months ago with nothing. She was riding toward the man who had publicly discarded her, and the chancellor who had built a trap with both their names in it, and the council chamber where the shape of the next 10 years was being hammered out right now, today, without waiting for her permission. She leaned forward over the horse's neck, and she asked it for everything it had. The Capitol walls came into view at dusk. The obsidian towers, the outer gate, the city she had spent 6 years building from the inside. And from half a mile out, she could already see the smoke. Not fire. Not yet. Something worse. Signal fires on the eastern gate towers. The emergency code. She knew it because she had written the emergency signal system herself in the second year of her tenure, and she remembered exactly what that sequence meant. Internal breach. Council chamber. Alpha King. She pushed the horse harder. The eastern gate was open. Not breached. Open from the inside, which was worse. A breach meant force from outside. An open gate meant someone inside had decided to let the outside in. She pulled her horse up at the outer approach and read what she was looking at. No gate guards, the signal fires burning their emergency sequence on the towers above, and through the open arch the sounds of a city that was not burning but was not calm either. The specific low noise of a large population that has heard something terrible and is waiting to find out if it is true. Aldenmere pulled up beside her. His face was doing military math. Council chamber is in the central keep, she said. 2 approaches. The main corridor from the palace gate and the service passage through the east wing. Vane will have the main corridor covered. You know this palace. I know every passage in this palace. She looked at the open gate. The service passage lets out near the chamberlain's antechamber. From there it's 40 feet to the council chamber side entrance. How many men do you need? 4. She looked at him. The rest stay here and hold the gate. If Valder has forces moving north in response to Vane's signal, they cannot come through this gate. Aldenmere said, You don't know that Valder. Vane's motion to strip Kael's authority was the trigger event. It was always the trigger event. Not for a war, for an absorption. Valder's forces have been staged at the Ember Straits for a month. The moment Kael is legally neutralized, they move north under the pretense of stabilizing an ally in political crisis. She watched understanding settle into Aldenmere's face. Hold this gate. I'll handle the chamber. She dismounted before he could argue and took 4 of his soldiers and went through the gate on foot. The palace was a building she had lived inside for 6 years, and it received her like a place that remembered her footstep weight. She moved through the service passage with the 4 soldiers behind her and the sounds of the palace around them. Voices in distant rooms, the running feet of staff who had heard the emergency signals and were doing the things staff did in crises, which was move toward information or away from danger depending on their function. She was moving toward both. She thought about Kael in the council chamber. She thought about what an emergency motion to strip executive authority looked like from the inside. The procedural architecture of it, the way Vane would have staged it, the votes he had secured in advance, the language he would have used to make a coup look like governance. She had read enough Valor administrative law to know exactly how it worked, and exactly how fast it could move if the votes were there and the chair was compliant. She thought about the signal fires and what the sequence meant. Internal breach, council chamber, Alpha King. And she did not let herself think about what that could mean in its worst configuration, because the worst configuration was not useful information until she was in the room and could see for herself. 40 feet from the chamberlain's antechamber, she heard voices, loud, overlapping, the acoustic signature of a large room in active conflict. She stopped. She looked at the 4 soldiers. Stay at the door unless I signal, she said. Nobody enters unless there's steel. She opened the side entrance. But the council chamber was a long room with high windows and a central table that seated 20, and Lunara had sat at this table enough times to know every face that belonged here and every face that didn't. She counted in the first second, 16 council members, 12 of them seated, 4 standing, 12 armed soldiers in council colors positioned at the main entrance and the 2 side walls. Merrick Vane standing at the head of the table in the chair that was not his, the chair that belonged to the Alpha King, which he had either taken or been standing near when everything became what it was. And Kael. He was standing, not seated, not restrained, standing in the middle of the room with 2 soldiers flanking him and his hands at his sides and his face doing the locked down thing. There was blood on his jaw. Not a lot. Enough to tell her that something physical had happened in this room before she arrived, and that someone had put hands on the Alpha King, and that Kyle had made the decision to not respond to that in the way every instinct in him would have demanded, because responding would have given Vane the justification he needed. He saw her the moment she entered. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The specific shift of a man who has been calculating survival odds and just had one of the variables alter significantly in his favor. Vane saw her 2 seconds later. He looked at her across the council table with the expression of a man who has spent 11 months building a structure and has just watched someone walk through the wall he thought was solid. The expression lasted 1 second, and then it was gone, replaced with the procedural blankness of a man who has a legal argument and intends to use it. "Luna Vale," he said. "This is a closed council session. Your presence here is unauthorized." "High Chancellor Vane." Her voice was even. She walked to the table. Nobody stopped her because her walk communicated an absolute assumption that nobody would stop her, and in the 1 second it took them to recalibrate from surprise to action, she was at the table with her hands flat on the surface and the 32 pages of documentation extracted from her coat. "Your correspondence with Emperor Sirath Valdur. 11 months. Routed through the Eastern inspection posts under merchant log codes." She looked at the council members one by one. "Your coordinated positioning of Southern forces at the Ember Straits has manufactured leverage for a treaty that was designed not to secure the Empire, but to weaken this king and isolate the Eastern territories for Southern absorption." The room was very still. Vane said, "Those are fabricated documents." "They are your documents," she said. "In your code, with your contacts confirming logs on the receiving end. I have 6 copies and 6 sets of hands across the northern province, and 2 are already with noble houses that have been waiting 3 years for grounds to move against your council consolidation." She looked at him. "You can call them fabricated. You can make that argument. I look forward to watching you make it when Bernard and the Northern Coalition ask you to decode the merchant logs in open session." The silence had weight. She looked at the council members again. She had sat with these people. She had briefed them, argued with them, watched some of them be managed by Vane, over years of careful political positioning. She knew which ones were his and which ones were afraid, and which ones had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. "The motion to strip executive authority," she said. "Has it passed?" One of the seated members, an older woman named Cassandra, who had been on the council since before Kael's father died, said quietly, "Not yet. It was called to vote when you entered." Lunara looked at Vane. He looked back at her, and she saw it. For the first time in 6 years of watching his face across tables, the thing underneath the procedural blankness. Not rage, something older and colder. The expression of a man who has built carefully for a very long time and is watching the structure come apart and is calculating, even now, whether there is a path through. He was still calculating. That was the dangerous part. "Arrest her," he said to the soldiers. "Unauthorized entry into a closed council session. Obstruction of—" "The Hearth and Eastern Provision," Kael said. Everyone looked at him. He had not raised his voice. He spoke with the specific controlled weight of a man who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. His jaw was still carrying the blood. He looked at Vane from across the room, and his face was no longer locked down. It was open, in the way a weapon is open when it has been drawn. "The administrator of an independent territory established under the Hearth and Eastern Provision has standing to present documentation of administrative corruption in adjacent Vialor jurisdictions in any council session," Kael said. "That provision was signed into charter 6 years ago. By me, on the recommendation of my Luna." He paused. "She is not unauthorized. She has more standing in this room right now than you do." The word you landed with a precision she could feel from across the table. Vane's face went through something it had never gone through in her presence before. The loss of certainty. Brief, fractional, but real. "The motion," Cassandra said, looking at the council members. "Those who oppose." She raised her own hand. 3 others followed. Then 2 more. The arithmetic shifted in real time. Vane said, "You're making a decision based on documents whose provenance is your own hand," Lunar said. She did not shout. She did not need to. You built this. You built it for 17 years, and you built it well. And you built it on the assumption that you were the only person in this empire who understood how governing systems actually work. You were wrong about that. You have been wrong about that since the day I arrived. She looked at him. The documents are real. The network is exposed. The northern houses are moving. Valdor's forces at the Ember Straits are not moving tonight because I have 200 Brenner cavalry and Aldenmuir's garrison holding the Eastern Gate and the Ashen Dominion's Eastern Road network under my administrative authority, which means any southern advance comes through documented independent territory and triggers an international incident that Valdor cannot afford while his Eastern Sea campaign is still unresolved. She set her hands on the documents. It is over, she said. Not because I beat you, because you built on the assumption that nobody would look at what you were building. I looked. The vote finished. The motion failed. In the specific silence that followed, Merrick Vane looked at her across the council table for a long moment, and she looked back, and she did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of it, the years of it, the cost of it, the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent 3 months preventing a catastrophe that should never have been necessary. She felt all of that, and she stayed on her feet through it, because the work was not done yet, and staying on her feet was still the job. 2 of Aldenmuir's soldiers appeared at the main entrance. Vane looked at them. He looked at the council. He looked at the documentation. He set down the gavel that was not his to hold. It took 4 more hours to secure the chamber, process the documentation formally into council record, begin the emergency communication to Aldenmuir, to hold the Eastern Gate until the Ember Strait situation could be formally resolved through the Ashen Dominion's border standing, and issue the preliminary orders that would constitute the beginning of the end of Vane's network. Lunara was present for all of it. She sat at the council table, not in any official capacity, not with any title, just present as the person who had the information and knew how to apply it, and she worked through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, precisely, without drama. Kael worked beside her. Not the way they had worked beside each other for 6 years, not the easy parallel motion of 2 people who have shared enough physical and professional space that they move without collision. This was more careful, more deliberate. The working of 2 people who are aware of every foot of distance between them and are choosing, for now, to use that distance as a working surface rather than a wound. At some point, someone brought food. She ate because her body needed it, and she had learned a long time ago that refusing basic maintenance during a crisis was how capable people became incapable at the worst moments. She noticed Kael eat too, which told her something about his current relationship to self-preservation. He had always, under pressure, forgotten to eat. She filed that. She did not comment on it. By the time the critical documentation was secured and the preliminary orders issued and the chamber had emptied of everyone except the 2 of them and a single attendant who was recording the final session notes, it was late. The kind of late that feels geological, time that has been through too much to be measured in hours. The attendant finished and left. The council chamber was quiet. She looked at the table in front of her. 6 years of sitting at this table. The grain allocation arguments, the provincial reform proposals, the late nights when the work ran past midnight and the attendants all went home and it was just her and Kael and the maps and the problem. She had been good here. She had done real work that lasted, work that was still in the walls of 11 provinces, and no one had taken that from her. Not the plaza steps, not the banishment, not Vane's network or Valdor's maneuvering. The work was still in the walls. It would outlast all of them. She stood up. She picked up her coat. Lunara. She turned. Kael was still at the table. He was not doing the lockdown thing. He was not performing anything. He was just sitting there looking at her with the blood still dried on his jaw and the tiredness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for 3 months and is no longer pretending it isn't heavy. "Sit down for a minute," he said. "Please." She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat back down. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was choosing words carefully, which he did more often than people who didn't know him realized. He was not a fast talker. He was a deliberate one. "I made the wrong calculation," he said. "Not a mistake. A choice. I chose what I thought the Empire needed over what I knew was right, and I told myself those were the same thing because that was easier than knowing they weren't." He looked at his hands on the table. Vane built the trap, and I walked into it because I wanted to believe the structural argument. Because if the structural argument was sound, then I wasn't doing something wrong. I was doing something hard. He paused. It was wrong. It was wrong, and it cost you something I can't give back, and I need you to know that I know that. She listened to this. She let it land without immediately building a response, because the response in her was complex and not all of it was clean, and she had learned enough about herself over the past 3 months to know that the clean parts and the not clean parts both deserved to be heard before she opened her mouth. She thought about the 10 minutes on the broken dock at the river, the precision-bounded grief, the way she had stood up and put her boots on and started walking and had not stopped. She thought about what the walking had made, the 40 pages of documentation, the surplus grain, Harlan's bridge that became a road that became a 3-district infrastructure network. Hess and Drea and Vark and Solt and Corin and the 40 people who had stood in a line on a road because they had decided what they were building was worth standing in front of. She thought about who she had been when she walked out of this palace and who she was now, and she recognized that the version of herself sitting in this chair was not a diminished version of the person who had stood on the plaza steps 3 months ago. She was something else, something that had been possible but not yet actual, that had required the breaking to become real. She had needed to be discarded to find out what she was worth outside someone else's structure. She did not say this, not because it wasn't true, but because it was true in a way that belonged to her, not to this conversation. "I know you know," she said. "That's not enough, and we both know it. But it's a place to start from, if there's going to be a start." He looked at her. "Is there going to be a start?" She held his gaze. She thought about the ink on his thumb that morning at the relay station, the 7 words in his private handwriting, the way he had come alone on a gray horse at dawn, because some things could not be delegated. She thought about the Ashen Dominion, its 40 pages of documented progress, its 200 organized people, its water routing and salt operations and road network and grain surplus. Her ground, her structure, built by her hands for her reasons, subject to no one else's authority. She was not going to give that up, not for a palace, not for a title, not for the warm gravity of a familiarity that had once felt like home. The Ashen Dominion was hers, and it was going to remain hers, and any start they made was going to have to be made around that truth, not over it. "The Ashen Dominion is a sovereign entity," she said, "independent governance, permanent. That is not negotiable, and it is not temporary, and it is not going to be absorbed back into Valor's administrative structure regardless of what happens between us personally." "I know," he said. "I need you to say it formally, in writing, with the council seal. I'll have it drafted tomorrow." She nodded. She looked at the table for a moment. "The Empire needs reform," she said. "Not the kind that gets proposed and archived, the structural kind. Council charter, provincial governance, the military appointment system. All of it needs to be rebuilt from the foundation, and it needs to be rebuilt by people who understand governing systems rather than people who understand how to maintain their position within governing systems." She looked at him. "That is a 10-year project minimum." "I know," he said again, quietly. "I've been sitting in this palace for 3 months watching everything you built hold together without you and everything I kept hold together with thread." She felt that land. Not with satisfaction, with the specific weight of being seen accurately by someone who knows you well enough to be accurate. It was not a comfortable feeling, it was a real one. "I can't come back to what it was," she said. "That's not what I'm offering." "What are you offering?" She thought about it. She thought about it with the same precision she brought to routing problems and charter language and trade network architecture, because this was the most important structure she would ever build, and she was not going to build it wrong. "Partnership," she said finally. "Real partnership. Not the version where I stand behind and to the left and inform the decisions of someone else's authority. 2 governing entities, independently legitimate, working on shared problems because the shared problems are real and matter and require both of us." She paused. "If you can do that, if you can actually do that, not perform it, then yes. There is a start." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him receiving it, not just hearing it, receiving it. The way he received things he understood were important. the particular stillness of him when something had landed at the level that mattered. "I can do that," he said. She believed him, not because she was naive. She was the least naive person in this empire, and both of them knew it, but because she had spent 6 years learning the difference between what this man said and what this man meant. And right now, in the empty council chamber with blood dried on his jaw and the wreckage of Vane's architecture around them, he meant it. She stood up again. She picked up her coat again. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow we draft the Sovereignty Charter and begin the Council Reform Framework and send formal communication to Valdur's delegation indicating that the Eastern Territories are under joint Veilor-Ashen Dominion oversight, which makes any Southern military advance an act of aggression against 2 sovereign entities rather than 1. She pulled the coat on. "It's going to be a long day." He almost smiled. She saw it, the edge of it, the familiar shape of his face, when the lockdown thing finally released and something real came through. "Lunara, sit," he said. She stopped. "I'm glad you didn't burn the letter," he said. She stood in the doorway of the council chamber, the room where 6 years of her work lived in the walls, the room where Vane had tried to dismantle everything and failed, the room that smelled like old stone and burnt candles, and the particular institutional weight of a place where decisions had been made for a very long time. She thought about the letter in her coat. She had read it 6 times. She had carried it 300 miles. She had not burned it. "I know," she said. She walked out. 3 weeks later, the Sovereignty Charter was signed and witnessed and formally entered into the Veilor record. The Ashen Dominion appeared in official documentation for the first time as a recognized independent entity with defined borders, autonomous governance, and full treaty standing. Not a province, not a vassal state, not a territory under imperial oversight. A sovereign civilization in its own right, born from 400 miles of abandoned waste and 3 months of work and 40 people who had stood in a line on a road. Lunara signed it at the Eastern Junction on a table Harlan had built with Vark and Drea and Hess and Solt watching. She signed it with the same hand that had been carrying ink stains for 3 months from the planning room work, and she looked at the signature for a moment after she put down the pen. Her name. Just her name. No title before it, no affiliation after it, no one else's authority in the letters. She thought about the woman who had stood on palace steps with irrigation proposals in her hand and a civic identity built entirely in relation to someone else's power. And she thought about the woman who was sitting at this table with a signed sovereignty charter and 40 pages of documented surplus and a water routing system that had just completed its first full season without failure. The same person, a different structure. The Reform Council in Veilor began its work the same week. It would take years. She had said 10, she suspected 15, because institutions embedded in centuries of habit did not move on project timelines. But it had begun, and it had begun because the political ground had shifted enough to make it possible, and the ground had shifted because the documentation had moved when it needed to move, and the people had stood where they needed to stand, and one writer named Corin had ridden hard enough on one specific morning to change the shape of what came next. She returned to the customs hall that evening. She returned to the maps and the routing problems and the second phase of the water project and the Eastern Road expansion that Harlan had been planning for 6 weeks, and the trade framework with the Brenner Holdings that was generating the Ashen Dominion's first formal external revenue. She returned to the work. Kael came east for the first time 3 weeks after that, alone, on the same gray horse, no insignia, arriving at the junction in the early morning. He did not come as a king visiting a vassal. He came as someone who had something to learn and had enough sense to know it. She showed him the water routing system and the salt operation and the road network and the grain surplus. She showed him what 400 miles of abandoned territory looked like when someone decided it was worth something. She showed him the ledger with 40 pages of entries in her handwriting, and the second ledger that Drea had started and the third that Vark was filling in. He was quiet through most of it. Not the locked-down quiet, the receiving quiet. At the end, standing at the Eastern Road junction, where she had faced down 3 council columns with 40 people and no army, he looked at everything she had built, and then he looked at her. "I don't know how you did this," he said. "Yes, you do," she said. You watched me do the same thing for 6 years on a larger scale. You just weren't watching what actually made it work." He thought about that. What made it work? She looked at the road under their feet, the repaired surface, the drainage channels Harlan had engineered, the junction markers she had written the specifications for. Real things. Built things. Things that would be here when they were not. "I stopped doing it for an audience," she said. "I stopped doing it to prove something or to hold something or to be recognized for it. I did it because the work was real and the people were real, and that was enough." She looked at him. "That's the only reason anything this size holds together, when you do it for the thing itself." He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She had learned, over 3 months of choosing who to wait for and who to move past, that some people were worth waiting for while they thought, and that the waiting was not the same as standing still. You could be patient and still be moving. You could hold a door open without walking back through it. The morning light was on the eastern road. Somewhere in the fields past the junction, Drea's voice was calling instructions to the harvest crew in the specific sharp cadence she used when she was running ahead of schedule and wanted to stay there. Harlan was on the northern construction site by now, the early riser he was, already into the first problem of the day. Hess was at the salt flat. Vark was at the settlement. The Ashen Dominion was going about its mourning. "Stay for the week," she said, not as a king, as someone who needs to understand what a governing system looks like when it's built right. She looked at him. "I have things to teach you, and I have stopped being patient about teaching them." He looked at her with the edge of the almost smile. "That's not the warmest invitation I've ever received." "No," she said, "it's an honest one." He considered this for a moment. She watched him, the tiredness still in his face, but differently distributed now, less like weight and more like history, the kind a person carries forward rather than under. The blood on his jaw from the council chamber was long gone. The ink on his thumb was new, which meant he had been writing through the night again, which meant he was engaged with something that mattered enough to lose sleep over, which was either a good sign or a warning, depending on what the something was. She realized she wanted to know what it was. That wanting, specific, interested, present tense, was different from the grief she had carried for 3 months. It was not the ghost of something. It was the beginning of something she had not named yet, something still in its structural planning phase, something that would take time and care and the particular patience of building on honest ground instead of assumption. She was good at building on honest ground. "All right," he said. She turned toward the customs hall. After a moment, she heard him fall into step beside her. Not behind her, not ahead of her, beside her. The weight of him moving at her pace on her road. She did not say anything, neither did he. They walked toward the building with the maps on the walls and the 40 pages of documented work and the morning noise of people who had built something real together, and the eastern road stretched behind them in both directions. Back toward the empire they would spend years rebuilding, forward toward the territories she was still mapping, and in neither direction was there any clean end or comfortable resolution, just the next problem and the next season and the next phase of work that needed doing. That was enough. That had always been enough. The work continued.